is my motivation to just go viral, or is my motivation to feel God's given me a message that I hope blesses people and helps them in their spiritual walk?
Hi, I'm Carl Vaders, and welcome to the Church Lobby, Conversations on Faith and Ministry. In this episode, we're continuing our series based on the content of my new book, De-Sizing the Church, How Church Growth Became a Science, Then an Obsession, and What's Next. In this episode, I'm talking with Daniel Darling about a Twitter thread, now X of course, that I quote in De-Sizing the Church. So far in this series, we've looked at the dark side of fame and the danger of celebrity, but I think it's important to see the other side as well. In this tweet, Dan expressed an appreciation for the fame of Tim Keller because it was due to that platform that he and so many others were introduced to Keller's teachings. Dan's perspective on the value of having a platform is an important balance to our conversations about the dangers of celebrity. Daniel Darling is the director of the Land Center, and he's a regular contributor to publications like USA Today, World, and many more. And don't forget to stick around when the interview is done. I'll come back with an overview of the content, and I'll let you know who I'll be interviewing in next week's De-Sizing the Church podcast. Dan Darling, welcome to the Church Lobby. Great to have you with us today. I really appreciate your time.
Carl, thank you so much. And I just have to say, I've been reading you for years. Just honored to be on here to have a conversation with you.
It is weird to be in that mode because I came out of the pastor world, and when somebody knows what you've said, it's because they're sitting in front of you and there's 50 to 100 people and we all know each other. And it's really weird to be in a position where, me with you too, I've read your stuff. I have an idea where you're coming from, and yet we don't have a relationship. So I'm still getting used to people going, hey, I know who you are. I've read your stuff. And I go,
oh, yeah. Yeah. Or like in an airport, I don't know if you have this, like, I'll be at a conference or an airport and people are like, yeah, I follow you online. And I'm sitting there thinking, oh man, what did I just tweet? Or what did I just, or I read your newsletter, I read your stuff. I'm like, what did I just say? You're
yeah.
just self-conscious about it. Am I stewarding this well? But anyways.
Yeah. Which is hopefully for those of us who are living a somewhat healthy emotional and spiritual life, that's what that should call us to. When somebody says, hey, I'm reading what you're writing, or I'm listening to your podcast or whatever, it shouldn't puff us up to go, yeah, I'm really something. It should make us pause to go, am I being a good steward of that space that people
Yeah.
are reading and listening and watching that I'm may not be aware of all the time? So that's what you're saying is not false humility. What you're saying, I think, is a proper moral check within our own emotions and our own spirits that we all ought to have, huh?
Well, hopefully, or it's just like panicking about maybe I just tweeted something I shouldn't have or something. But yeah, it is kind of funny the work that we do. And I've always thought about this, Carl, especially more in the last few years as I'm teaching writers and stuff, is you just don't know who's at the other end of your words when you are a creator, when you're preaching, when you're teaching, when you're putting together an article or a book or doing a podcast. You don't know who's at the other end of it. You just don't.
Yeah, it is. This is something I'm learning with writing. And again, when you're speaking, especially if it's a live in the room audience, there is an immediate feedback and an immediate connection between you that can help drive you, that can also help check you, that can also help in developing the relationship between the people that you're talking to. But you write a book and you put it out in the world. And by the time it actually gets out and people are reading it, it's been months, sometimes a year or more since you actually really wrote the thing. And then it exists in a space by itself. My books sit on somebody else's bookshelf in places that I've never seen, never been. And I literally have no idea the impact it's had on most of the people who've read it. And there's that weird disconnect that I'm still getting used to. And I hope I never fully get used to, I hope.
Yeah, I think so. And it's one of those things where it's really a leap of faith to write something, to put something out there. In one sense, how will it be received? We all think about that, but also, how could God use this in a way just think about this. I have students that I'm having them read C.S. Lewis, right? And Lewis has been dead since 1963. When he first wrote those words, he had no idea who would read them, who would be at the other end of them. People are still reading his stuff, still having their lives transformed by it. It's just an interesting thing that God calls us to do sometimes.
Dean, who really never was appreciated for what he wrote while he was alive and who has now become far bigger than anything he possibly could have imagined with the Lord of the Rings series. My goodness. Before we go any further than this, tell us a little bit about yourself. You mentioned already, maybe it was before we went with recording here, that you pastored for a while and now you're doing other things. Walk me through your life of ministry from pastoring to what you're doing today as the director of the Land Center for Cultural Engagement.
Yeah, so I've had this really interesting life, I think, really going all the way back. My father walked forward at a Billy Graham crusade in 1971 in Chicago and became a Christian. He was in a broken home. They were unchurched. His father is alcoholic. His stepfather struggled with alcoholism. Didn't have much direction. He walked forward, really changed the whole trajectory of his life, but of the whole family. I mean, I'm not doing anything I'm doing if that doesn't happen. He marries my mom, who is Jewish. She passed away last year, but my mom is Jewish, and she becomes a Christian. And I grew up in the church, became a Christian at a young age. I always had really three things that I loved. I always loved the ministry. I always felt called to the ministry. I love church. I love ministry. I still do. I still love Sundays. I love going to church. I love teaching, preaching, whatever I can do. I always felt called to ministry. I always loved writing and words. Our family got three newspapers every day to our house: the Chicago Tribune, Chicago Sun-Times, the Daily Herald, and I read them all. We didn't have a TV, so I read from early age. I loved words, and I had a junior high teacher tell me one time when I turned in some assignments, she just said, "Man, I think you have some talent with writing." And when you're a middle school kid, junior high kid, and you're kind of clumsy and you're awkward, when you have a teacher tell you, "Hey, here's actually something you're good at," you sort of take it and run with it. And I did that.
Oh, yeah.
And then I've always loved the culture and politics and American history, presidential history. So all those three things have sort of been my thing. And the Lord's taken me on a winding path. For a while I was working in communications and publishing, writing and editing for a Christian organization. And then I went and pastored a church for about 6 years, which I loved. It's a wonderful church in the Chicago area, Chicago suburbs. And then I went to work for the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, Russell Moore, for about 8 years, kind of in the space between the church and the culture and thinking through those things. How should Christians steward their citizenship and steward their moment here, and helping equip the church, all those things. And then now I'm teaching college students, and I'm running this Land Center and doing a lot of writing and thinking. I don't like the word thought leader because I just think it's very pretentious.
That way to be. Yeah, I hear you.
And this whole time I've sort of been writing, so when I started pastoring, my writing career really took off. I started writing books. Our mutual friend, Drew Dick, he brought me on at Leadership Journal. Remember Leadership
Right.
Journal?
Oh, yeah.
And I started doing interviews with Christians there. I started writing for Leadership Journal, writing about the church, and it just sort of took off from there. And the Lord's been really good to me with that. And I have a beautiful family. I have a wife of 21 years. We have 4 kids, 4 teenagers. And so it's a really full, fun, busy life right now.
That'll keep the two of you busy for sure. So now
Yeah.
you're the director of the Land Center for Cultural Engagement. What's that all
Yeah.
about, and what do you do there?
Yeah, so it's a center that's named after Richard Land, who was a very influential thought leader. He was president of the ERLC for 25 years, and mostly the 20th century into the 21st century. But really, our goal is to really help Christian. I mean, it's really a number of things. One, to help Christians think through moral and ethical issues. How do we steward this moment that we have? How do we, as Americans, how do we think through politics and policy, but not just that part of culture, but all of culture, whether it's work and faith and art and all those kinds of things. So we host events, we have fellows that write for us. We do some things like that. But then we have a faith and culture concentration at the college here, Texas Baptist College, that I teach in, and I teach those classes. And then I do a fair amount of writing and speaking on these kinds of things, and really enjoy it.
What you do, it has a great overlap with my book that just came out, Desizing the Church, How Church Growth Became a Science, Then an Obsession, and What's Next, because it really does talk about that cultural engagement and thinking a little bit deeper than simply how many butts are in the seats, about what we're doing, how we're doing it, and why we're doing it. And the reason I wanted to talk to you today specifically is I did quote you in my book. And I've already interviewed Caitlin Beatty, the author of Celebrities for Jesus, and Wynne Collier, who wrote Eugene Peterson's biography. And we talked about a chapter that I've got that's entitled Inevitable: Why the Christian Celebrity Culture Guarantees Moral Failure. They've offered the side of the danger of celebrity, as I do in my book. But one of the reasons I wanted to quote you is because you offered, I think, what is a small but very healthy balance to this idea that basically not all fame is bad. And what you did was you tweeted this, and I'll give most or all of the tweet thread where you said this about the fame of Timothy Keller. And I believe you wrote this probably shortly after Timothy had passed, right? Is that what had happened, what
Yeah.
inspired it? Yeah, so Keller passed, and there was a lot of conversation, justifiably so, about the impact that he had on so many people, including me and you. You said, we often rightly critique a relentless pursuit of the platform, but I'm glad there have been faithful Christians with a wide audience, you wrote, because they made their way to me. If Keller isn't published by a mainstream publisher, I don't get to read his works. And I think this about so many other men and women whose words have helped shape me. If they were not published in books or on Christian radio or in a podcast or in a magazine article, I never would have had access to their wisdom. There are so many ways fame can be perverted and can destroy and can be tribal, but there are also many ways a wide audience can be used for God's glory. First of all, thank you for that nuanced and balanced other side of that. But let me ask you to expand on it, because you can only get so much in Twitter. But let's talk about what is the value of having the bigger platform and how do we defend against the downsides of it?
Well, it's interesting. And I wrote at length about this in my book, Agents of Grace. I have a chapter on this, but there's all this conversation about the celebrity industrial complex, evangelicals, platform, a lot of angsty stuff back and forth. There's some really good critiques of perverse incentives sometimes and what it takes to build a platform and how sometimes we judge the character of people based on how many people they reach. There's some really good critiques of that. There's also some really good critiques of maybe the way we elevate people as leaders and heroes, maybe before they're ready, right? So I think of some of the high profile falls that we've had, and I think almost every one of them was given a massive platform really early on. And we've seen that in music, we've seen that in Hollywood, we've seen that everywhere. That's hard to bear. And I don't know if anybody, very few of us could handle that, right? You think guys like Justin Bieber, Britney Spears were all of a sudden have this massive platform, world-renowned celebrities at early ages, and it can be damaging to the soul. So I think those critiques are good. On the other hand, you will always have people with platforms. You always have people whose message, whose giftedness brings them beyond their small location in every generation. Now, this is a unique time because of the digital age where it's maybe easier to be heard or easier to build things, perhaps. Some people say it's actually harder because of, there's so many voices, but we've always had
Yeah.
this, right? I mean, think about this. We read Martin Luther, we read John Calvin, we read all these folks. We read the church fathers, Augustine. They had big platforms. They were well-known Christians of their day. Augustine was well-known in his day. We're still reading him today. I'm grateful that those men and many women reached beyond their local context because we are enriched by them, right? I think about Charles Spurgeon. People get mad when I say this, but it's just true. Charles Spurgeon was pastor of a megachurch.
Oh, yeah, by any standard.
He preached, but he also wrote sermons that he published. He published a newsletter. He felt called by God to take what God was teaching him to a wider audience, to pastors and all. And we benefit from that. I'm glad that happened because I get to read Spurgeon, right? And it just go on, like C.S. Lewis is one of my favorite authors and has shaped me in so many ways and so many others. I'm glad that his words made their way around the world so that I can hear them. I'm glad Chuck Swindoll had a platform bigger than his church, because when I was in college and I would listen to Moody Radio, I heard his preaching. It was very formative for me. And so I think we have to be careful about thinking, well, if someone has a huge platform, they must care about it for these, carnal purposes. It's always bad. I think we have to be careful about judging that. Sometimes it sounds a little bit like resentment. I don't want to assume someone's motives. And what I also find funny too, Carl, is this, and push back, by the way, if I'm wrong on any of this, but I just think it's ironic if someone's going to record a podcast or write an article about the problem of celebrity and the problem of platform. And I'm always asking myself, So do they hope only 10 people read it or listen so they don't become a celebrity? Like, how does that
Yeah,
work? So,
yeah,
anyways,
yeah.
those are my thoughts. So I think we have to be careful. I think we have to get at is the motivation. Is my motivation to just go viral, or is my motivation to feel God's given me a message that I hope blesses people and helps them in their spiritual walk? The key thing is making sure that our gifting doesn't outstrip our character, that our platform doesn't run ahead of our character. That makes sense.
It's exactly the way I put it in the book. And no, I've got nothing to push back against you on that, Dan. That's part of the reason I had you on today is because you provide that wonderful alternative. Yes, we want more people to hear. Yes, we want more people to know. I think it is a good thing to do what we can to make sure that that happens. I promote my books. I promote this podcast. I promote my blog. And when I was pastoring, I promoted the church because that's how people hear that you're there so that they can hear the message that you think is worth putting out. But I think the way you framed it is the best way to look at it. If you're doing it simply because you want to go viral, because fame for its own sake, celebrity for its own sake, is a toxic, dangerous thing that consumes everything in its path. But if you're starting with, this is a message worth hearing. This is something that can really bring value to people's lives. This is something that I know God is calling me to do. And if that is your starting point, and then you say, and I want as many people as possible to hear, see, and know this, as long as the end game is not the fame or celebrity itself, but is a good thing that fame or celebrity will be a channel that helps you get it to
Mm-hmm.
more people, I think that's good. The challenge, however, is even if you start with that goal, celebrity and fame are so appealing and they're so powerful that I think we're constantly having to guard against the appeal of celebrity for the sake of celebrity, even if we started out with good motives. So, and now a short break to talk about something else. If you like the content you're hearing, here are two things you can do for us. First, forward this podcast to a friend. Second, consider becoming a financial supporter through Patreon, Venmo, or PayPal. Just go to carlvaders.com/support. For as little as $3 a month, you can help us put these resources into the hands of the ministries that need them the most. Our support link is in the show notes. Here's my question for you. Assume I've started with good motives, assume I've got a good message, and assume that this is a message that is really helpful for a lot of people to hear, and I'm going to push that. How do I guard against celebrity going from a channel through which I get a good message out to becoming the end in itself? Are there any advice you would give for those who are seeking an audience that we don't go down the wrong path with that?
Well, I think first of all, we have to be, and especially for Christians, Christian speakers, writers, I hate the word influencer because I don't even know what that means. But I think first of all, number one, maintaining our spiritual disciplines is really key. I mean, one of the things that I think Tim Keller, and this is a thing that very few people talk about, they want to model Keller's view of the church and the culture, how he does church work, how he does church planning, how he engages the culture. And those are all incredible models. But Keller was fastidious about his spiritual disciplines. He was asked one time the key to his preaching, and it says reading the Bible through year after year over a lifetime. And he read the John Bunyan and the Puritans and was reading, minding his soul. He's really a pietist in that sense. And I think that's what kept him grounded as a pastor. So I think the spiritual disciplines, I also think being embedded in local church life. I just wrote a thing on my newsletter where we have, I think, the rise of these, what I call churchless commentators, where they're kind of disembodied from the life of the church. And they're just sort of like Christian critics or whatever. And I take more seriously the words of people who are embodied in local church life, who are going every week to sit with brothers and sisters in small groups and in worship. I'm in a small group, and most of the people in our church don't know the last 15 controversies that happened online. They're living their lives, they're taking their kids to school, they're going to their jobs, they're trying to reach their communities and trying to do things like that. There's an older gentleman who his wife's had dementia for the last decade, and he's had to carefully guide her through that. He comes in and he's got this worn out Bible. There's a single mom trying to piece it all together. If you're not in community with people like this, I think that's where you can get ahead of yourself and let these things go to your head. Sometimes when I read critiques of the church, Carl, People write these big, wide sweeping critiques of evangelicals or whatever. And all they see is voting blocks and cohorts and groups. And I'm like, are you actually in community with real people with names and faces? I think
Sometimes.
that's one thing that pastoring did for me, Carl. It just, it remember like, so I just think that's so important. And really to have people in your inner circle of your life who can tell you, hey, I think you messed that up, or hey, I wouldn't say that, or why did you do that? Or I have a couple text threads of friends that we've had for years. And, we agree on the essentials, but we don't agree on everything. And sometimes when political issues come up or church issues, we disagree, sometimes very strongly. And just to have that in your life to keep you from that bubble, to keep you from that place where all you're thinking about is yourself and your metrics and your success and all that kind of stuff. Does that make sense?
I think it's one of the great danger spots is if you don't have anybody who can call you on that stuff. If
Hmm.
you are a law unto yourself and you don't have, and I would say even more than one person, if you just got, well, I've got this one person or I've got my spouse, okay, that's good. But you need more opinions than that because it's very easy to draw one person into your own echo chamber before you realize that they think they're independent and critiquing, but they've been drawn in by it as well. But if you've got multiple people, that's a much greater defense against them also becoming part of that little inner circle echo chamber and separated from everybody else. And I do think, as you're saying, even having people who have some different history, some different takes on things, different Christian traditions bringing into it is all very, very helpful. There's a balance to that. I think if we start with, as you said, growing in Christ daily, spiritual maturity, discipleship, and then we speak out of that, then I think you can get to what I would term as legitimate fame, where you are known, as you wrote about Tim Keller, for doing things of quality and of depth, and that
Hmm.
other people are really learning from. I don't have any desire to shrink away from a larger platform, but I step towards it cautiously. And I
Yeah.
think we should all step towards it cautiously. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with that. And to not back away from what God's called you to do, because I think Paul's telling Timothy to don't neglect your calling, to step into your calling. Oswald Sanders, his book on leadership, spiritual leadership, which I think still holds up today. It's one of my favorites. And he talks about how Moses was sheepish to step into his calling. He said, if God's giving you something, you should step into it with confidence, but also hold it loosely in the sense that you see that this is all a gift from God. I think gratitude is really important.
Huge.
And, I watched Jim Harbaugh's press conference yesterday with the LA Chargers. I love
Mm.
football. And I don't know if you like Harbaugh or not, people like him or not, but he said, his first thing was, man, I just have gratitude. Gratitude that I have these opportunities. Just to say, man, God's given me some really great opportunities. I'm thankful. None of this is owed to me. I tell young writers, nobody owes you a book contract. Every time if a publisher gives you a book contract, they're taking a big risk on you. Nobody owes you a book contract. Nobody owes you a byline. Like I'm really fortunate to write for all these places, but the Lord could take all that away. I mean, no one owes me that. And so I just think to have that gratitude, to have good relationships in your life, and to take whatever God has as a gift from God. When I look at someone like Keller, he was very grounded. And I think he also realized, and I think we don't realize this too in church world, like in our leadership world, Carl, like in our green room bubble that we are all in, we think these guys are big and famous. If you polled my church or some random church, they probably couldn't name the people that we think are super famous. They might be able to name Tim Keller, maybe, and maybe like Max Lucado, but they probably don't know half the people we think are such a, you know what I'm saying? So we have to get some
Yeah.
reality here, you know?
Yeah,
Right.
I think that's, in fact, I know that's true because I've had a couple experiences recently where I was talking with other ministers and somebody else got drawn in who is a Christian, but who doesn't spend their time in this Christian bubble that we spend our time in. And they knew none of the names we were talking about to the point where we're looking at them and going, really? Like Rick Warren, you never heard of him? He's like, he wrote like one of the
Right.
most popular books of all time.
Right.
Sorry,
Right.
I go to church, I read my Bible, I love Jesus, I serve the people in my local church. I
Right.
don't read religious news. It's like, and you know what? That's okay. He's not missing anything by not knowing any of those names, including mine.
Yeah. In fact, it's refreshing. It's
It
refreshing.
is. Yes, that's a great way to put it.
when I was at the ERLC and I'm in green rooms all the time with all these people that I admire. And we were at the razor's edge of news and controversy and all. And then I'd go to church in my small group there in Nashville. And people don't know the last 15 things, controversy online. They don't even know it happened. They really don't. And that's to me refreshing because sometimes I think you have like the sort of leadership class. In my view, Twitter's like a green room. And we have this leadership class that we're having conversations in. But the laity, for lack of a better term, is over here. And they're talking about a few things, but they're not plugged into this stuff. And so I think we have to remember that too. That can ground us as well.
Your balanced take on this, on that there's nothing dangerous or wrong with seeking a platform as long as you've got something valuable to share, to be able to make sure that we're not doing it for the sake of that. And that even when we get to the point where we think that fame has just simply been all consuming and so big, there's a whole big section of people out there who are just living their lives and just don't care. So maybe we can learn as much or more from them as they can from us. I really appreciate all this insight today. Thank you so much for it, Dan. I really appreciate it.
Well, Carl, thank you for you. And I have loved your work highlighting what God is doing in small and medium churches around the country, really, which is like the average church. And you've done it in such a way that is really winsome, and you're not taking shots at mega churches back and forth, that artificial controversy. You just say, hey, God's doing some great work at these places. Pastors, if you're pastoring one of these places, if your church isn't blowing up like everyone else, God's still blessing you. I've loved that so much, the work that you've contributed there.
Thanks so much. I really appreciate Dan's balanced take on this. As I say in Desizing the Church, fame is not evil, but it is dangerous. But as we've seen, it can also be helpful in getting good information to as many people as possible. So my take on this is take the platform when it's presented, use it as you can, but always be aware of the potential dangers of it. Not long ago, I had the opportunity to speak to a group of thousands of people, and that never happens to me. And when I did so, there was some great appreciation for the opportunity to get out my information to a very large audience very, very quickly. But in that, I also saw some of the dangers, some of the depersonalization, particularly when you're speaking to a crowd and when you don't have a chance to connect with individuals. So never let the crowd become more important than the individuals. In the next episode, I'm starting a short series within a series, I guess within a series. At this point, it's like the movie Inception. I'm not sure how deep it's going. Anyway, we are now within this Desizing the Church series, going to conclude it with 3 what I'm calling first reaction episodes. I'll be interviewing people who read advanced copies of Desizing the Church. I've asked them to weigh in on the parts of the book that caught their attention the most. First up in the first reactions will be Matt Steen. He's the co-founder of Chemistry Staffing, a group that helps connect the right pastor with the right church. So he and I will talk about the subject, are we too quick to re-platform fallen pastors? This will include the idea that some pastors should never be re-platformed at all, what the right timing is, and how to be sure we're not re-victimizing people that they may have hurt. This episode was produced by Veronica Beaver. It was edited by Phil Vaders. Original theme music was written and performed by Jack Wilkins of jackwilkinsmusic.com. The graphic design is by Solomon Joy. And me, I'm Carl Vaders, and I hope to talk with you again in the church lobby.